Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the introductory video on the Jobava London System. This video will be covering the main ideas, a few variations, and some of the common mistakes that both black and white can make. So the Jobava London arrives from the move order d4, and pretty much whatever black plays here, you're going to follow up with knight c3. One thing to keep in mind is if you get something like e5 or c5, or even f5, it's not exactly possible to play the Jobava London, and you're going to have to learn specific systems in playing against those openings. So after d5 or knight f6, you're going to play knight c3, and let's say d5 now, you're going to play bishop f4. What makes the setup special and gives it its own name? Well, for one, we have a knight on c3 after we played the move d4. Generally speaking, in d4 openings, you want to play something like c4 in order to challenge the center for black. However, in this opening, we actually start with knight c3, which is a concession in its own right. However, this allows for more aggressive and dynamic play for white. So the plan for us, after playing knight c3 and playing bishop f4, is to play knight b5 and target this weak c7 square. Don't get fooled, this isn't a one-trick pony type of opening. White does not rely on black blundering the c7 square fork, and instead white has a bunch of theory that provokes a lot of weaknesses for black and causes some very interesting games that really aren't that well studied, so it's very easy to catch your opponents off guard. There's a couple of things to know. If your opponent plays something like g6 and goes for a King's Indian approach, and after bishop f4, if they play bishop g7, then you're already better because you can just right away put a pawn in center. That's why it's really important for black to play d5. If you don't see d5 from your opponent and something like bishop g7, very non-committal move, you're going to have a very pleasant advantage after the move e4. Now let's say d5 now, you can just close down the center and play e5, kicking this knight out and securing a very nice, stable center and a comfortable advantage. Let's say your opponent is playing for a more Queen's Gambit declined approach, and after bishop f4 plays e6. Here you have two moves. So the main line is sort of considered e3, and here you have a very standard way of playing, just a very solid center. You have a close the doors behind this bishop after developing it. You're going to continue with knight f3, bishop d3, or bishop e2. You can castle or even expand in the center with g4 and h4 ideas, and you're going to have a very stable game. However, the other move is knight b5, and as mentioned earlier, you're targeting the c7 square and going for this fork. White has multiple ways of defending it. The biggest and most popular one is knight a6. However, this puts the knight on a very awkward square, and I mean, generally speaking, a lot of the time you're going to get kicked out with c6, you're going to go back to c3, and black is going to go back to b8. So you're going to get these very weird, repetitive type moves. There's also the opportunity for black to defend multiple other ways, such as bishop b4 check, and after the move c3, with bishop a5. This is something that is very common among grandmasters, and this is how most grandmasters defend. The point of this is that now it's very easy to kick our knight out with c6 and force it onto a very passive square with a3. And also, black hasn't committed this knight to a6, which is a very bad square for the knight, of course. And this bishop on a5 is pretty well placed. So in my personal experience, I would say that playing knight b5 is slightly inferior to the move e3. Of course, whenever I'm playing blitz, I generally go for knight b5 just because it's a more aggressive approach and I rarely face bishop b4 check. So both options are very much playable, but in longer time controls, e3 is definitely the move for me. And that is the move that I'll be focusing on primarily. Now, in which cases can we actually play knight b5 after we play e3? Well, one of the most popular moves here and a very easy mistake to make is c5. And c5 is very natural, it challenges the center right away, and it's something that you see a lot in d4 openings. However, now we can play knight b5 for multiple reasons. So one, our knight cannot get kicked out with c6, and two, there's no bishop b4 check. There's also no queen a5 shenanigans because our bishop protects this knight. There's an example I want to show you guys very quickly, in that there's sometimes this immediate c5 move, and in this case you may be prompted to play knight b5. However, here there is this queen a5 check, and because you haven't played e3, you're forced to play, knight back to c3, and you've pretty much wasted a move. You've allowed black to develop their queen, and black would be very comfortable here and much better. So of course, very important is that if you're playing knight b5, make sure that you've either already played e3, or that there's a pawn on c7 which obstructs queen's development to a5. So if you get c5 here, of course, knight b5, and now the only move is knight a6. And this knight on a6 is stuck here for a very long time. In fact, it doesn't have any good squares or any way to kick your knight out, and you can easily solidify the center and just maintain a decent advantage. So here the move c3 is very nice. It's not as in the last position where there was a bishop on a5, because there was a pawn on c6 which could kick your knight out and force it to a3. Here, black doesn't have any option to kick your knight out, and you can just keep it on b5 for as long as you'd like. Therefore, c3 is very nice. This is in spirit of the London system, which the Jobava is quite similar to. Black can play something like knight c6, and you're going to be just a little bit better, because obviously black wants to challenge the center with something like c5, and if black doesn't do that, black's just going to be inherently worse in this position. And so here you could start with knight f3, can even start with knight b5 right away. But then there's obviously this bishop b4 idea with c3 and bishop a5, which is kind of unpleasant to deal with as white. So I'd say just start with knight f3. You have bishop b4 at any given moment. You can play bishop d3 and not worry about that. If black decides to capture your knight, you're going to recapture with your b-pawn, and it may seem temporarily that you have a weakened pawn structure. However, this is ultimately not the case, because as soon as this bishop moves out of the way, you can play rook b1 and target this weak pawn. And even if that doesn't happen, you can always play c4 and challenge the center, and then eventually you're going to undouble your pawns. Just continue with like c3 or something. Going to be completely fine and actually much better in this position. So bishop b4 isn't something to be worried about after, let's say, castles. You still have this knight b5 idea now, and the game is very simple from there. This was just a sort of quick overview to get you accustomed to the plans and ideas of this sort of structure. Let's talk about a few different things that can also happen in this position. So very popular is this immediate c5, and as I already mentioned, this knight b5 maneuver does not work. In this case, you simply play e3, and from there your development is simple. Now, e3 does open up the potential for this knight b5 maneuver, so this can easily transpose into the same variation we've already discussed. Your opponent can try a couple of things here. Let's talk about the most popular ones, which is just capturing the pawn. I would advise against taking with the queen because of knight c6, and here you're pretty much pressured into moving your queen again. It's very uncomfortable. I'd suggest just recapturing the pawn to temporarily isolate this pawn. However, obviously you will move this knight out of the way and then play something like c3. So this isn't something to be really worried about. Just an example line is, let's say, a bishop g4, f3, kick the bishop out, knight b5, this trade can occur, knight c6, and then c3. And you're extremely solid in this position. Your development is simple. Once again, something like knight e2, and then you can expand with g4, g5, h4, and h5, h6 ideas. And that is something you will see a lot in the Jobava London, in fact. Very often, you will not castle, or at least not castle at kingside. You're actually going to opt in to play g4 and g5 instead. And the point is, in those sort of structures, you're a lot more aggressive and more dynamic. It's a lot easier for black to mess up. Technically, you could castle and still be completely fine, but the game's going to be very positional, and black generally is able to equalize. With g4, g5, and h4, h5, h6 ideas, pressuring all of this, it's very hard for black to defend. Besides that, black can also play something like c4. I advise you to play e4 immediately, just strike in the center right away. If this trade occurs, you simply recapture with your bishop, you're very happy. Of course, if the knight takes, you're going to capture this knight, ruin black's pawn structure, then capture this pawn with the bishop. And I mean, if you evaluate this position, it's fairly easy to tell that white is winning here. You've got two pieces developed in a very nice square. Black at 0. This pawn is very weak and a very easy target with something like knight e2 and knight g3, or even queen e2. This is not something to be worried about. c4 isn't a scary variation. Of course, you have to learn to play in a different way since you trade the c3 knight off. But it's nothing to worry about, because after this you can play c3, solidify your pawn chain, and be completely fine. I can also approach this in a King's Indian Grunfeld type of style with bishop f4 and d5, where there's no pawn on c4, so this isn't exactly a Grunfeld. This is going to be a very interesting King's Indian. Here you can play e3, once again close the door behind this bishop. Bishop's being developed, so now log this pawn chain, make it very difficult for black to access and find weaknesses in your pawn structure. After bishop g7, for example, we have this immediate h4 move. This is something that's been popularized lately a lot. A lot of grandmasters play this early h4, h5 advance against the Grunfeld. It's been shown to perform really well. For example, if your opponent avoids it and plays something like c6, right away you have, bishop e2, h5, and then you can strike with g4 at any given moment. So there's a lot of things you can do in this position. It's very easy to create an attack and actually fight for a very big advantage. Black, of course, could start with d5. However, most of these will transpose into variations we just covered. But there's also the c6 move, which is the Slav defense. After bishop f4, this kind of prevents this knight b5 jump. And instead, you're going to follow up with e3 and pretty much the same plans that I just discussed earlier. However, you also have a4 and b4, b5 ideas with maybe placing your rook on b1 and creating a queenside minority attack. I have a completely separate video available on that if you guys are interested in watching that. It will be available in the link above me. Please feel free to check that out. Oh, and by the way, if you're finding this video useful, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps my channel out a ton, and it will help you get notified when future videos come out. Guys, of course, there's also a bunch of obscure options. For example, against d4, there's the England Gambit, or this Benoni system, or even the Dutch defense. And for example, against the Dutch, you can't really play the Jobava. I mean, you can play knight c3 and, run into this, but you lose all advantage, which you can obtain from playing against the Dutch in a more traditional and proper way. For example, when you face the Dutch defense, it's very much preferable to place a pawn on c4 because it's very hard for black to challenge this. So you're going to play something like the Fianchetto system, which is what I recommend. And then you can play, knight f6, c4. You can even play bishop d2 and queen c1. because this bishop gets fianchetto, and then you can aim to trade it off. So it's going to be completely different. I'm going to have a video which covers every single one of these sidelines, including the England Gambit and the Benoni Banco system. That's going to be in a separate video because that's a lot to cover, and it really has nothing to do with the Jobava London, because unfortunately against these openings you have to learn how to play against them rather than follow up with the Jobava London system. Last but not least, guys, I want to show you a game played between Alexander Bortnik. This was a blitz game played during Title Tuesday, and Alexander Bortnik is one of the best and most well-renowned Jobava London players. He's very skilled in this opening. Him and Daniel Naroditsky have a course on the Jobava London, which I do not own, but I've seen people speak very highly of it. So if you guys are interested in that, feel free to check that out. This is going to be a sort of recap of his game, which will illustrate some of the main ideas that you can see in the Jobava London. So we start with the Jobava London, and we get this sort of mirrored system where black wants to close down the center with e6 and pretty much play a reverse London system. That's pretty much what happens. Very quickly, Bortnik jumps the knight into e5. As I said, that's super common in the Jobava London because this knight is very strong from e5. It's a very nice apple square. And if the straight ever occurs, the bishop is more than comfortable on this e5 square. And of course, this knight cannot move out of the way because that hangs the pawn. We get h6, bishop d3, trades, and he recaptures with the knight. This is common, and the reason for that is it prevents c5 ideas. c5 is very common against any d4 opening because obviously it challenges the center. And in that case, simply this trade would occur, and then the knight could recapture, and Bortnik would be up a pawn. The engine doesn't really like this move that much. It doesn't mind it, but it really prefers c takes d3, and that's a super interesting line where eventually you're going to castle, play something like rook fe1, queen e2, or queen d2, rook d1, and you're going to play e4, striking in the center, and you're going to eventually undouble these pawns, and you're just going to be a little bit better throughout the entire game because this pawn mess might seem awkward right now. But after e4, it's very difficult for black to maintain any sort of central control. An example of this is something of this sort, where both sides castle, you know, queen e1, and then e4. And if this trade occurs, for example, d4 here, I mean, like I said, very strong center for white. This pawn is now challenging black's center, so that's very annoying to deal with for black. That doesn't happen, though, when we get knight d3, castles, and queen f3. And Bortnik actually takes with the e-pawn. That is something you wouldn't expect to see. You would think this knight would just take automatically. That's not the case because, once again, c5 ideas are prevalent and black would be better here. So this knight needs to stay on d3 for a certain period of time in order to ensure that c5 isn't possible. And instead, he takes this with the e-pawn. This creates a Maroczy bind sort of structure, and this also means that this e5 square is very well supported. So white makes a concession in the fact that now this e4 square is very weak. However, white's e5 square, white has a very strong e5 square that they control now. Knight c6 gets played, and Bortnik plays queen e3, which is actually a mistake in this position because it would allow for the move knight b4. Now, both players didn't see this because it was a blitz game, so totally understandable. Of course, this isn't the most, accurate game of the Jobava London or the most accurate representation, but it showcased a lot of the ideas that you will see in the Jobava, such as the knight e5 jump or recapturing with the knight, which prevents c5. The point here is that after knight b4, white cannot protect this pawn, and for example, queen e2, right away, h5, there's not a single move that white can play that would stop the knight from capturing this d4 pawn. So of course, if queen f3, with the idea of after h5, play knight e2, this will be a fine position for white. However, after queen f3, the knight can simply take this pawn. White has to capture this knight, and after this check, black wins this rook. So black gets 2 pawns and a rook for 2 knights, obviously a favorable exchange for black. And so queen e3 was a mistake. Indeed, a better move would have been to just play knight e2, for example, which would support both of these pawns and would enable c3. This would keep the game equal and very balanced. Wesley So does not spot knight g4 and plays a5, after which Bortnik plays f3. This sets up this g4 maneuver, and at this point both players were very low on time, so I'm just going to skim through the rest of the moves because it doesn't really encompass the Jobava London ideas. However, I feel like the first half of this game was a perfect example of what some of your games might look like, especially with this knight e5 jump and then recapturing with this d3 knight, and maybe taking it with this f-pawn and creating a Maroczy bind sort of structure. Ultimately, here, white's plans resolve in playing g4, h4, h5, or g5, and creating some sort of kingside attack. That is pretty much what happens in this game. As I said, I'm just going to skim through these moves. So, castles, we get some trades, g4 gets played, and then f5. We get some development, and both players very low on time. Eventually, Bortnik is able to secure this knight on f5 with a very nice square. Plays rook f1. Some trades occur, and at the end, Wesley So plays a very, very big mistake of taking this pawn. This is a poison pawn because after the move rook c1, you can notice that this rook is cut off and there's no way for black to defend it. Obviously, this move does not work because the queen hangs. And so no matter where black moves, this rook would be hanging. And so at that point, Wesley resigned and boarding won the game. This sums up everything I wanted to show you guys for the introductory video on the Jobava London. I hope you found this informative, and if you did, feel free to check out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in a future video.